the LibriVox 11th Anniversary Song, sung to the tune of It's a Long Way to Tipperary, original words and music by Jack Judge and Harry Williams, celebratory LibriVox lyrics by Maria Casper. This is a LibriVox recording sung in honor of the 11th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
It's a long road to meet our mission. It's a long road, but fun.
Yeah, fun.
Every book in the public domain. We will read them one by one.
One by
one. It's been 11 years now, and still we're far from done. There are more books waiting on the doorstep. We've barely begun. Ancient classics, romantic sci-fi, history's rebels and kings,
mighty novels
and witty essays, tender poems that take wing. Woohoo! Playing drama and melodrama, we sometimes even sing.
Whether comic, tragic, or historic,
The book is the thing.
Yes, sir.
Some of us lend our voices, while some lend our ears.
Proof listeners.
Some
dig
dig
for
for
hidden
hidden treasures in archives far and near.
archive.
From all around the world we have come together here. How many books have we recorded? 10,000 by this year.
Wow.
So let's celebrate together.
Throw a party that rocks.
Woohoo!
Sing happy anniversary.
Shout hurrah for LibriVox.
It's been 11 years now,
And still we're far from done.
there are more books waiting on the doorstep. We've barely begun.
Van harte gefeliciteerd. End of the LibriVox 11th Anniversary Song, sung by 16 enthusiastic LibriVoxiteers.
Aesop's Fables, embellished with 111 emblematical devices. This is a LibriVox recording in honor of the 11th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Aesop's Fables, Fable 3, The Lion and the Four Bulls. 4 bulls, which had entered into a very strict friendship, kept always near one another and fed together. The lion often saw them, and as often had a mind to make one of them his prey. But, though he could easily have subdued any of them singly, yet he was afraid to attack the whole alliance, as knowing they would have been too hard for him, and therefore contented himself, for the present, with keeping at a distance. At last, perceiving no attempt was to be made upon them, as long as his combination held, he took occasion, by whispers and hints, to foment jealousies, and raise divisions among them. This stratagem succeeded so well that the bulls grew cold and reserved towards one another, which soon after ripened into a downright hatred and aversion, and at last ended in a total separation. The lion had now obtained his ends, and, as impossible as it was for him to hurt them while they were united, he found no difficulty, now that they were parted, to seize and devour every bull of them, one after another. Application. The moral of this fable is so well known and allowed that to go about to enlighten it would be like holding a candle to the sun. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand, and as undisputed a maxim as it is, was, however, thought necessary to be urged to the attention of mankind by the best man that ever lived. And since friendships and alliances are of so great importance to our well-being and happiness, we cannot be too often cautioned not to let them be broken by talebearers and whisperers, or any other contrivance of our enemies. End of Aesop's Fables, embellished with 111 emblematical devices. An Edinburgh 11, Pencil Portraits from College Life, by J. M. Barrie. This is a LibriVox recording read in honor of the 11th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 6. Professor Campbell Fraser. Not long ago I was back in the old university. How well I remember pointing it out as the jail to a stranger, who had asked me to show him round. I was in one of the library ante-rooms when someone knocked, and I looked up, to see Campbell Fraser framed in the doorway. I had not looked on that venerable figure for half a dozen years. I had forgotten all my metaphysics. Yet it all came back with a rush. I was on my feet, wondering if I existed strictly so-called. Calderwood and Fraser had both their followings. The moral philosophers wore an air of certainty, for they knew that if they stuck to Calderwood, he would pull them through. You cannot lose yourself in the back garden. But the metaphysicians had their doubts. Fraser led them into strange places, and said he would meet them there again next day. They wandered to their lodgings, and got into difficulties with their landlady for saying that she was only an aggregate of sense phenomena. Fraser was rather a hazardous cure for weak intellects. Young men whose anchor had been certainty of themselves went into that class floating buoyantly on the sea of facts, and came out all adrift on the sea of theory, in an open boat, rudderless, one oar, the boat scuttled. How could they think that there was any chance for them, when the professor was not even sure of himself? I see him rising in a daze from his chair, and putting his hands through his hair. "Do I exist?" he said thoughtfully, "strictly so-called?" The students, if it was the beginning of the session, looked a little startled. This was a matter that had not previously disturbed them. Still, if the professor was in doubt, there must be something in it. He began to argue it out, and an uncomfortable silence held the room in awe. If he did not exist, the chances were that they did not exist either. It was thus a personal question. The professor glanced round slowly for an illustration. "Am I a table?" A pained look traveled over the class. Was it just possible that they were all tables? It is no wonder that the students, who do not go to the bottom during their first month of metaphysics, begin to give themselves airs strictly so-called. In the privacy of their room at the top of the house, they pinch themselves to see if they are still there. He would, I think, be a sorry creature who did not find something to admire in Campbell Fraser. Metaphysics may not trouble you, as it troubles him, but you do not sit under the man without seeing his transparent honesty and feeling that he is genuine. In appearance and in habit of thought he is an ideal philosopher, and his communings with himself have lifted him to a level of serenity that is worth struggling for. Of all the arts professors in Edinburgh, he is probably the most difficult to understand, and students in a hurry have called his lectures childish. If so, it may be all the better for them. For the first half of the hour, they say, he tells you what he is going to do, and for the second half he revises. Certainly he is vastly explanatory, but then he is not so young as they are, and so he has his doubts. They are so cocksure that they wonder to see him hesitate. Often there is a mist on the mountain when it is all clear in the valley. Fraser's great work is his edition of Berkeley, a labor of love that should live after him. He has two Berkeleys, the large one and the little one, and to do him justice, it was the little one he advised us to consult. I never read the large one myself, which is in a number of monster tomes, but I often had a look at it in the library, and I was proud to think that an Edinburgh professor was the editor. When Glasgow men came through to talk of their professors, we showed them the big Berkeley, and after that they were reasonable. There was one man in my year who really began the large Berkeley, but after a time he was missing, and it is believed that some day he will be found flattened between the pages of the first volume. The Selections was the textbook we used in the class. It is sufficient to prove that Berkeley wrote beautiful English. I am not sure that anyone has written such English since. We have our own stylists, but how self-conscious they are after Berkeley. It is 7 years since I opened my Selections, but I see that I was once more of a metaphysician than I have been giving myself credit for. The book is scribbled over with posers in my handwriting about dualism and primary realities. Some of the comments are in shorthand, which I must at one time have been able to read, but all are equally unintelligible now. Here is one of my puzzlers. Does be here mean impercipient and unperceived subject, or conscious and percipient subject? Observe the friendly be. I dare say further on I shall find myself referring to the professor as F. I wonder if I ever discovered what B meant. I could not now tell what I meant myself. As many persons are aware, the Selections consist of Berkeley's text with the professor's notes thereon. The notes are explanatory of the text, and the student must find them an immense help. Here, for instance, is a note. Phenomenal or sense-dependent existence can be substantiated and caused only by a self-conscious spirit, for otherwise there could be no propositions about it expressive of what is conceivable. On the other hand, to affirm that phenomenal or sense-dependent existence, which alone we know, and which alone is conceivable, is, or even represents, an inconceivable, non-phenomenal, or abstract existence, would be to affirm a contradiction in terms. There we have it. As a metaphysician I was something of a disappointment. I began well, standing, if I recollect aright, in the 3 examinations, 1st, 17th, and 77th. A man who sat beside me, man was the word we used, gazed at me reverently when I came out first, and I could see by his eye that he was not sure whether I existed properly so called. By the 2nd exam his doubts had gone, and by the 3rd he was surer of me than of himself. He came out 57th, this being the grand triumph of his college course. He was the same whose key translated cras donaberis hodo, tomorrow you will be presented with a kid, but who, thinking that a little vulgar, refined it down to tomorrow you will be presented with a small child. In the metaphysics class I was like the fountains in the quadrangle, which ran dry toward the middle of the session. While things were still looking hopeful for me, I had an invitation to breakfast with the professor. If the fates had been so propitious as to forward me that invitation, it is possible that I might be a metaphysician to this day. But I had changed my lodgings, and when I heard of the affair, all was over. The professor asked me to stay behind one day after the lecture, and told me that he got his note back with "left," no address on it. However, he said, "You may keep this," presenting me with the invitation for the Saturday previously. I mention this to show that even professors have hearts. That letter is preserved with the autographs of 3 editors, none of which anybody can read. There was once a medical student who came up to my rooms early in the session, and I proved to him in half an hour that he did not exist. He got quite frightened, and I can still see his white face as he sat staring at me in the gloaming. This shows what metaphysics can do. He has recovered, however, and is sheep farming now, his examiners never having asked him the right questions. The last time Fraser ever addressed me was when I was capped. He said, "I congratulate you, Mr. Smith," and one of the other professors said, "I congratulate you, Mr. Fisher." My name is neither Smith nor Fisher, but no doubt the thing was kindly meant. It was then, however, that the professor of metaphysics had his revenge on me. I had once spelt Fraser with a Z. End of An Edinburgh 11 by J. M. Barrie.
The Constitution, Amendment 11, by the United States Congress. This is a LibriVox recording, read in honor of the 11th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Constitution, Amendment 11, passed by Congress March 4, 1794, ratified February 7, 1795. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state, or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. End of The Constitution, Amendment 11, by the United States Congress.
An Edinburgh 11. Pencil Portraits from College Life by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording read in honor of the 11th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rev. Walter C. Smith, D.D. During the 4 winters Another and I were in Edinburgh, we never entered any but free churches. This seems to have been less on account of a scorn for other denominations than because we never thought of them. We felt sorry for the men who knew no better than to claim to be on the side of Dr. MacGregor. Even our free kirks were limited to 2, St. George's and the Free High. After all, we must have been liberally minded beyond most of our fellows, for as a rule those who frequented one of these churches shook their heads at the other. It is said that Dr. White and Dr. Smith have a great appreciation for each other. They, too, are liberally minded. To contrast the 2 leading Free Church ministers in Edinburgh as they struck a student would be to become a boy again. The one is always ready to go on fire, and the other is sometimes at hand with a jug of cold water. Dr. Smith counts 100 before he starts, while the minister of Free St. George's is off at once at a gallop, and would always arrive first at his destination if he had not sometimes to turn back. He is not only a Gladstonian, but Gladstonian. His enthusiasm carries him on as steam drives the engine. Dr. Smith being a critic with a faculty of satire, what would rouse the one man makes the other smile. Dr. White judges you as you are at the moment. Dr. Smith sees what you will be like tomorrow. Some years ago the defeated side in the great assembly fight met at a breakfast to reason itself into a belief that it had gained a remarkable moral victory. Dr. White and Dr. Smith were both present, and the former was so inspiring that the breakfast became a scene of enthusiasm. Then Dr. Smith arose and made a remark about a company of Mark Tapleys, after which the meeting broke up. I have a curious reminiscence of the student who most frequently accompanied me to church in Edinburgh. One Sunday, when we were on our way to Slushy Bath Street to Free St. George's, he discovered that he had not a penny for the plate. I suggested to him to give 2d. next time, but no, he turned back to our lodgings for the penny. Some time afterward he found himself in the same position when we were nearing the Free High. "I'll give 2d. next time," he said cheerfully. I have thought this over since then, and wondered if there was anything in it. The most glorious privilege of the old is to assist the young. The 2 ministers who are among the chief pillars of the Free Church in Edinburgh are not old yet, but they have had a long experience, and the strength and encouragement they have been to the young is the grand outstanding fact of their ministries. Their influence is, of course, chiefly noticeable in the divinity men, who make their Bible classes so remarkable. There's a sort of Freemasonry among the men who have come under the influence of Dr. Smith. It seems to have steadied them, to have given them wise rules of life, that have taken the noise out of them and left them undemonstrative, quiet, determined. You will have little difficulty, as a rule, picking out Dr. Smith's men, whether in the pulpit or in private. They have his mark, as the Rugby boys were marked by Dr. Arnold. Even in speaking of him they seldom talk in superlatives, only a light comes into their eye, and you realize what a well-founded reverence is. I met lately in London an Irishman who, when the conversation turned to Scotland, asked what Edinburgh was doing without Dr. Smith, who was in America at the time. He talked with such obvious knowledge of Dr. Smith's teaching, and with such affection for the man, that by and by we were surprised to hear that he had never heard him preach, nor read a line of his works. He explained that he knew intimately two men who looked upon their Sundays in Free High, and still more upon their private talks with the minister, as the turning point in their lives. They were such fine fellows, and they were so sure that they owed their development to Dr. Smith, that to know the followers was to know something of the Master. This it is to be a touchstone to young men. There are those who think Dr. Smith the poet of higher account than Dr. Smith the preacher. I do not agree with them, though there can be no question about the other of Ulrich Grange, and Mr. Alexander Anderson, and the two men now in Edinburgh, who have, at times, the divine afflatus. Surface Man is a true son of Burns. Of him it may be said, as never can be said of Dr. Smith, that he sings because he must. His thoughts run in harmonious numbers. The author of Ulrich Grange is the stronger mind, however, and his lines are always pregnant of meaning. He is of the school of Mr. Lewis Morris, but an immeasurably higher intellect, if not so fine an artist. Indeed, though there are hundreds of his pages that are not poetry, there are almost none that could not be rewritten into weighty prose. Sound is never his sole object. Good novels in verse are a mistake, for it is quite certain that they would be better in prose. The novelist has a great deal to say that cannot be said naturally in rhythm, and much of Dr. Smith's blank verse is good prose in frills. It is driven into an undeserved confinement. The privilege of critics is to get 12 or 20 minor poets in a row, and then blow them all over at once. I remember one who dispatched Dr. Smith with a verse from the book Under Treatment. Dr. Smith writes of a poet's verses, "There is no sacred fire in them, nor much of homely sense and shrewd." And when the critic came to these lines, he stopped reading. He declared that Dr. Smith had passed judgment on himself. This is a familiar form of criticism, but in the present case it had at least the demerit of being false. There is so much sacred fire about Dr. Smith's best poetry that it is what makes him a poet, and as for homely sense and shrewd, he has simply more of it than any contemporary writer of verse. It is what gives heart to his satire, and keeps him from wounding merely for the pleasure of drawing blood. In conjunction with the sacred fire, the noble indignation that means things should be, the insight into the tragic, it is what makes Hilda his greatest poem. Without it there could not be pathos, which is concerned with little things, nor humor, nor indeed the flash into men and things that makes such a poem as Dr. Linklater's Scholar as true as life, as sad as death. If only for the sake of that noble piece of writing, every Scottish student should have North Country Folk in his possession. The poem is probably the most noteworthy thing that has been said of Northern university life. End of an Edinburgh 11 Pencil Portraits from College Life by J. M. Barrie, Chapter 11. Read by Larry Wilson.
(1811) A Poem by Anna Letitia Barbauld. This is a LibriVox recording. read in honor of the 11th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Still the loud death drum, thundering from afar, o'er the vested nations pours the storm of war. To the stern call still Britain bends her ear, feeds the fierce strife, the alternate hope and fear, bravely, though vainly, dares to strive with fate, and seeks by turns to prop each sinking state. Colossal power with overwhelming force bears down each fort of freedom in its cause. Prostrate she lies beneath the despot's sway, while the hushed nations curse him and obey. Bounteous in vain, with frantic man at strife, glad nature pours the means, the joys of life. In vain with orange blossom sends the gale, the hills with olives clothes, with corn the vale. Man calls to famine, nor invokes in vain, disease and rapine follow in her train. The tramp of marching hosts disturbs the plough, the sword not sickle reaps the harvest now, and where the soldier gleans the scant supply, the helpless peasant but retires to die, no laws his heart from licensed outrage shield, and war's least horror is the ensanguined field. Fruitful in vain, the matron counts with pride the blooming youths that grace her honoured side. No sun returns to press her withered hand, her fallen blossoms strew a foreign strand. Fruitful in vain, she boasts her virgin race, whom cultured arts adorn in gentlest grace. Defrauded of its homage, beauty mourns, and the rose withers on its virgin thorns. Frequent, some stream obscure, some uncouth name, by deeds of blood is lifted into fame. Oft o'er the daily page some soft one bends, to learn the fate of husband, brothers, friends. All the spread map with anxious eye explores, its dotted boundaries and penciled shores. Ask where the spot that wrecked her bliss is found, and learns its name but to detest the sound. And think'st thou, Britain, still to sit at ease, an island queen amidst thy subject seas, while the vast billows in their distant roar but soothe thy slumbers and but kiss thy shore? To sport in wars while danger keeps aloof, thy grassy turf unbruised by hostile hoof. So sing thy flatterers. But Britain, know, thou who hast shared the guilt must share the woe. Nor distant is the hour, low murmurs spread, and whispered fears, creating what they dread. Ruin, as with an earthquake shock, is here. There, the heart whisperings of unuttered fear, and that sad death, whence most affection bleeds, which sickness only of the soul precedes. Thy baseless wealth dissolves in air away, like mists that melt before the morning ray. No more on crowded mart or busy street friends meeting friends with cheerful hurry greet. Sad on the ground thy princely merchants bend their ordered looks, and evil days portend, and fold their arms and watch with anxious breast the tempest blackening in the distant west. Yes, thou must droop, thy Midas dream is o'er. The golden tide of commerce leaves thy shore, leaves thee to prove the alternate ills that haunt, enfeebling luxury and ghastly want. Leaves thee, perhaps, to visit distant lands, and deal the gifts of heaven with equal hands. Yet, O my country, name beloved, revered, by every tie that binds the soul endeared, whose image to my infant senses came mixed with religion's light and freedom's holy flame. If prayers may not avert, if 'tis thy fate to rank amongst the names that once were great, Not like the dim cold crescent shalt thou fade, thy debt to science and the muse unpaid. Thine are the laws surrounding states revere, thine the full harvest of the mental year, thine the bright stars in glorious sky that shine, and arts that make it life to live are thine. If westward streams the light that leaves thy shore, still from thy lamp the streaming radiance pours. Wide spreads thy rays from Ganges to the pole. O'er half the western world thy essence roll. Nations beyond the Appalachian hills thy hand has planted and thy spirit fills. Soon as their gradual progress shall impart the finer sense of morals and of art, thy stores of knowledge the new state shall know, and think thy thoughts, and with thy fancy glow. Thy locks, thy palace shall instruct their youth, thy leading star direct their search for truth. Beneath the spreading Platon's tent-like shade, or by Missouri's rushing waters laid, old Father Times shall be the poet's theme, of Hagley's woods the enamelled virgin dream, and Milton's tones the enraptured ear enthrall, mixed with the roar of Niagara's fall. In Thomson's glass the ingenious youth shall learn a fairer face of nature to discern, nor of the bards that swept the British lyre shall fade one laurel or one note expire. Then, loved Joanna, to admiring eyes thy storied groups in scenic pomp shall rise. Their high-souled strings and Shakespeare's noble rage shall with alternate passion shake the stage. Some youthful bustle from thy moral lay, with stricter hand his fond desires shall sway. Some athwart, as the fleeting shadows pass, start at his likeness in the mystic glass. The tragic muse resume her just control, with pity and with terror purge the soul, while wide o'er transatlantic realms thy name shall live in light, and gather all its fame. Where wanders fancy down the lapse of years, shedding o'er-imaged woe's untimely tears, fond moody power, as hopes, as fears prevail, she longs or dreads to lift the awful veil, on visions of delight now loves to dwell, now hears the shriek of woe of freedom's knell. Perhaps, she says, long ages passed away, and set in western waves our closing day, night, Gothic night, again may shade the plains where power is seated and where science reigns. England, the seat of arts, be only known by the grey ruin and the mouldering stone, that time may tear the garland from her brow, and Europe sit in dust, as Asia now. Yet then the ingenious youth whom fancy fires with pictured glories of illustrious sires, with duteous zeal their pilgrimage shall take from the Blue Mountains or Ontario's lake, with fond adoring steps to press the sod, by statesmen, sages, poets, heroes trod, on Isis' banks to draw inspiring air, from Runnymede to send the patriot's prayer, and pensive thought, where camps slow waters wind, to meet those shades that rouge the realms of mind. In silent halls to sculptured marbles bow, and hang fresh wreaths round Newton's awful brow. Oft shall they seek some peasant's homely shed, who toils, unconscious of the mighty dead, to ask where Avon's winding waters stray, and thence are not wildflowers bearing away. Anxious enquire where Clarkson, friend of man, or all-accomplished Jones his race began. If of the modest mansion aught remains, where heaven and nature prompted Cowper's strings, where Roscoe, to whose patriot breast belong the Roman virtue and the Tuscan song, led Cyrus to the black and barren moor, where Cyrus never gained a wreath before, With curious surge their pilgrim steps shall rove by many a ruined tower and proud alcove, shall listen for those strings that soothed of yore thy rock, stern Skiddaw, and thy fall, Lodore, fist with Dun Eden's classic browed side, and visaged Melrose by the pale moonlight. But who their mingled feelings shall pursue when London's faded glories rise to view? The mighty city, which by every road in floods of people poured itself abroad, ungirt by walls irregularly great, no jealous drawbridge, no closing gate, whose merchants, such the state which commerce brings, set forth their mandates to dependent kings, streets where the turbaned Moslem, bearded Jew, and woolly Afric met the brown Hindu, where through each vein spontaneous plenty flowed, where wealth enjoyed and charity bestowed. Pensive and thoughtful shall the wanderers greet each splendid square and still untrodden street, or of some crumbling turret, mined by time, the broken stair with perilous step shall climb. Then stretched the viewed wide horizon round, by scattered hamlets trace its ancient bound, and, choked no more with fleet's fair time's survey, through reeds and senge pursue his idle way. With throbbing bosom shall the wanderers tread the hallowed mansions of the silent dead, shall enter the long aisle and vaulted dome, where genius and where valour find a home. Awe-struck, midst chill sepulchral marbles breathe, where all above is still as all beneath. Bended each antique shrine, and frequent turn to clasp with fond delight some sculptured urn, the ponderous mass of Johnson's form to greet, or breathe the prayer at Howard's sainted feet. Perhaps some Briton, in whose musing mind those ages live which time has cast behind, to every spot shall lead his wandering guest, on whose known site the beam of glory rests. Here Chatham's eloquence in thunder broke, here Fox persuaded, or here Garrick spoke, shall boast how Nelson, fame and death in view, to wonted victory led his ardent crew, and England's name enforced, with loftiest tone, their duty, and too well fulfilled his own. How gallant Moore, as ebbing life dissolved, but hoped his country had its fame absolved, or call up sages whose capacious mind left in his course a track of light behind. Pond where mute crowds on Davy's lips reposed, nature's coyest secrets were disclosed. John with their Franklin, Priestley's injured name, home then each continent shall proudly claim. Oft shall the strangers turn their eager feet, the rich remains of ancient art to greet, the pictured walls with critic eye explore, and Renoir's be what Raphael was before. On spoils from every clime their eyes shall gaze, Egyptian granites and the Etruscan vase. And when mist-fallen London they survey the stone where Alexander's ashes lay, shall own with humbled pride the lesson just by time's slow finger written in the dust. There walks a spirit o'er the peopled earth, secret his progresses, unknown his birth, moody and viewless as the changing wind. No force arrests his foot, no chains can bind. Where'er he turns, the human brute awakes, and roused to better life, his sordid heart forsakes. He thinks, he reasons, glows with purer fires, feels finer wants, and burns with new desires. Obedient nature follows where he leads, the steaming marsh is changed to fruitful meads. The beasts retire from man's asserted reign, and prove his kingdom was not given in vain. Then from his bed is drawn the ponderous oar, then commerce pours her gifts on every shore. Then Babel's towers and terraced gardens rise, and pointed obelisks invade the skies. The prince commands, in Tyrian purple dressed, and gypsy virgins weave the linen vest. Then spans the graceful arch the roaring tide, and stricter bands the cultured fields divide. Then kindles fancy, then expands the heart, then blow the flowers of genius and of art. Saints, heroes, sages, who the land adorn, seem rather to descend than to be born, whilst history, midst the rows consigned with fame, with pen of adamant inscribes their name. The genius now forsakes the favoured shore, and hates, capricious, what he loved before. Then empires fall to dust, then arts decay, and wasted realms enfeebled despots sway. Even nature's changed, without his fostering smile or fear no good, no plenty yields the Nile. The thirsty sand absorbs the useless rill, and spotted plays from putrid fens distil. In desert solitudes and Tadmor sleeps, stern Marius and o'er fallen Carthage weeps. Then with enthusiast love the pilgrim roves to seek his footsteps in forsaken groves, explores the fractured arch, the ruined tower, those limbs disjointed of gigantic power. Still at each step he dreads the adder's sting, the Arab's javelin, or the tiger's spring. With doubtful caution treads the echoing ground, and asks where Troy or Babylon is found. And now the vagrant power no more detains the vale of Tempe or Ausonian plains. Northward he throws the animating ray, o'er Celtic nations bursts the mental day, and as some playful child the mirror turns, now here, now there, the moving lustre burns. Now o'er his changeful fancy more prevail Batavia's dykes and Arnold's purple veil, and stinted suns and rivers bound with frost, than Anna's plains or Bayer's viny coast. Venice the Adriatic wets in vein, and death sits brooding o'er Campania's plain, o'er Baltic shores and through Hercynian groves. Stirring the soul the mighty impulse moves. Art plies his tools, arid commerce spreads her sail, and wealth is wafted in each shifting gale. The sons of Odin tread on Persian looms, and Odin's daughters breathe distilled perfumes. Loud minstrel bards in Gothic halls rehearse the runic rhyme and build the lofty verse. The muse, whose liquid notes were wont to swell to the soft breathing of the Aeolian shell, submits, reluctant, to the harsher tone, and scarce believes the altered voice her own. And now, where Caesar saw with proud disdain the watered hut and skin of azure stain, Corinthian columns rear their graceful forms, and light verandas brave the wintry storms, while British tongues the fading fame prolong of Tully's eloquence and Marius' song. Where once Bonduca whirled the scythed car, and the fierce matrons raised the shriek of war, light forms beneath transparent muslins float, and tilted voices swell the artful note. Light-leaved acacias and the shady plain and spreading cedar grace the woodland ring, while crystal walls the tenderer plants confine, the fragrant orange and the nectared pine. The Syrian grape there hangs her rich festoons, nor asks for purer air or brighter noons. Science and art urge on the useful toil, new mould a climate and create the soil. Subdue the rigour of the northern bear, o'er polar climes shed aromatic air. Unyielding nature urged the new demands, and ask not gifts but tribute at her hands. London exults. On London art bestows her summer ices and her winter rose. Gems of the East her mural crown adorn, and plenty at her feet pours forth her horn. While even the exiles her just laws disclaim, people a continent, and build a name. August she sits, and with extended hands holds forth the book of life to distant lands. But fairest flowers expand but to decay. The worm is in thy core, thy glories pass away. Arts, arms, and wealth destroy the fruits they bring. Commerce, like beauty, knows no second spring. Crime walks thy streets, Freud earns her unblessed bread. O'er want and woe thy gorgeous robe is spread, and angel charities in vain oppose. With grand earth grows the mass of misery grows. For see, to other climes the genius soars, he turns from Europe's desolated shores, and lo, even now, midst mountains wrecked in storm, and Andes' heights he shrouds his awful form. On Chimborazo's summits treads sublime, measuring in lofty thought the march of time. Sudden he calls, "'Tis now the hour," he cries, spreads his broad hand and bids the nations rise. La Plata hears amidst her torrents roar, Potosi hears it as she digs the ore. Ardent, the genius fans the noble strife, and pours through feeble souls a higher life. Shouts to the mingled tribes from sea to sea, and swears, "Thy world, Columbus, shall be free." End of 1811, a poem by Anna Letitia Barbauld. Read by Lilith Brander.
"11 Days at Moravia" by Thomas Hazard. This is a LibriVox recording read in honor of the 11th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the 26th of December, 1871, I took an evening train on the New York Central Railroad at Albany for Syracuse. Next morning at 6, took the cars on the same road some 26 miles to the depot at Auburn. Thence by omnibus 1/2 mile to the depot of the Southern Central Railroad. Thence some 17 miles to Moravia, where carriages were in waiting to take passengers to the far-famed Spirit House of Maurice Keeler, 3/4 of a mile for 50 cents each, the whole cost of railroad fare from Boston, omnibus, and back, hire included, being less than $11. Moravia is a pretty cozy-looking village of some 12 or 1500 inhabitants, pleasantly situated on the southwesterly declivity and base of a range of hills running along the easterly side of the rich alluvial Owasco Valley, which is several miles long and half a mile or more wide. Fortunately, I found a lodging-room vacant at Mr. Keeler's, there being less of a rush of visitors than usual, owing probably to the domestic festivities of the season. As a general rule, more or less newcomers are necessitated to lodge at the village. Though not on the summit, Mr. Keeler's house stands high on the hill. It is nearly new, of 2 stories, and larger and more commodious and tastily finished than most farmhouses. On its western side, or end, is a slight projection or alcove, forming in part the base of a tower or cupola of moderate height, commanding a fine view of the surrounding country. An apartment of convenient dimensions in the 2nd story, situated beneath this tower, is set apart exclusively for the spirit room. Like the rest of the house, this room is neatly finished and very prettily papered, with the exception I shall presently mention. Its furniture, all included, consists of an air-tight stove, a sofa, a kerosene lamp and candlestick, a small paper screen, a piano, and some dozen chairs, a large part of which are broken, rickety, or disfigured, in consequence of an ill-bred habit to which some spirits in the form are addicted of tipping back, greatly to the injury of both chairs and carpets. The alcove on which the cupola partly rests is partitioned off with rough boards, rudely and scantily papered, thus making a cabinet some 10 feet by 4 or 5 in size, an aperture about 12 by 13 inches being made in the center of the partition some 4 feet above the floor. A piece of black broadcloth, some 14 inches square, fastened at the top only, on the inside of this aperture, excludes or admits the light, the spirits in attendance raising or dropping it themselves to suit their purposes. 4 windows in the alcove within the cabinet are tightly boarded up and rudely pasted over with old newspapers. A movable door without hinges or latches, some 7 feet high by 2½ wide, which, with the aid of lists and buttons, it is rather difficult to adjust so as to exclude the light entirely from the interior of the cabinet, completes the meagre arrangement of a tiny room, in which more denizens of the angel spheres have probably shown themselves to materialize within the last few years than have ever made themselves visible in all the splendid cathedrals and costly churches of Christendom. The whole movable furniture or articles of any kind within the cabinet consists of 1 common wooden chair and 1 battered tin trumpet. Except when séances are being actually conducted, the cabinet stands open at all times for inspection. The medium, Mrs. Mary Andrews, by the aid of whose occult powers the spirits are enabled to make themselves visible to material eyes, is a rather stout, well-formed married woman, of medium height, apparently from 25 to 30 years of age. She is the mother of 3 nice little girls, the eldest of whom has been adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Keeler. Her husband owns a small house where they reside about half a mile away. Mrs. Andrews is comely in face and person, and bright-looking, and if nature meant to affix the stamp of dishonesty or trickery to her features, it made a most transparent mistake. She is very amiable and conversable with those who approach her with respect and kindness, but cannot give any explanation of the why and wherefore of the wonderful phenomena that occur in her presence. Her antecedents are rather remarkable, and I regret that I neglected to obtain a full knowledge of the incidents that attended her early youth and mediumistic development. I understood in brief, however, that her parents are Irish, and that she went in early girlhood to live with an American family not far from Moravia, to whom she became much attached, but was removed by her Catholic parents by direction of their priest, who suspected that the religious faith might be shaken by living in contact with her Protestant friends. Mary, however, was not satisfied with the new arrangement, and suspecting that her parents meditated consigning her to a conventional prison, she absconded from home, and was seen some days after, barefooted and half naked, wandering on the shores of the adjacent lake. She finally found employment in a family in Moravia, from whence she went to live as a domestic with Mrs. Keeler, under whose motherly care Mary's extraordinary medium powers were gradually developed. Mrs. Keeler, as well as her husband, was born and bred in Connecticut, and is one of those modest, unassuming, pale-faced American women who move about their houses with noiseless and apparently feeble step, and yet manage to accomplish more work in the same time than half a dozen of ordinary help could be hired to do. She always rises before day, and together with Hannah, her cook, a remarkably handsome and efficient specimen of the Celtic race, does the whole indoor work of the establishment, although there are generally some dozen or more lodgers in the house to be provided for, besides her own family. I marveled how our hostess was enabled to accomplish so much, until I accidentally learned that her spirit mother uniformly assists in performing the mundane duties of her daughter without charge for wages or expense of board. Mr. Maurice Keeler, our host, is a candid, hearty, honest, outspoken specimen of the Yankee farmer of the old Putnam stamp, who has, with help of his wife, earned his well-drained and well-cultivated broad acres, and something considerable besides, by honest thrift and hard work. He is a pretty tall, large, rough-looking man, who always hangs up his coat when he enters the house, and sits in his shirt-sleeves, though the thermometer may be at 0. Though troubled with asthma, he is pretty fat and jolly, too, and fond of giving and taking a good-natured joke. He accommodates boarders in plain but substantial farmer's style, at $1 per day, evidently more to please them and the spirits than from any pecuniary motives. I understand that he did so without charge until his hospitality was too much taxed for his means. At first my impressions were not strikingly in Mr. Keeler's favour, but he wonderfully improved upon acquaintance. I soon discovered that whatever might have been his weaknesses or peccadilloes in bygone days, his intimate relation and intercourse with the spirit world, or something else, had wonderfully softened and developed his better and higher nature. The heart of the old man seems as big as an elephant's, and filled with love and kindness for all mankind, including even his ignorant and bigoted neighbors, some of whom, I learned, have threatened him with private injury because of his spiritual proclivities. There is, too, a peculiar softness and tenderness of expression in his eye, rendered more striking by the roughness of its facial setting, When I regarded these fine traits and listened to the noble though uncouth utterances that often fell unconsciously from his lips, and heard him speak of calling instead of driving his cows to and from pasture, I began to love the uncultured, unlearned man, and ceased to marvel why the angels from heaven had passed by the monarch on his throne, the priest at his altar, and the parson in his pulpit, to come and dwell with plain and rough but true and spiritual-minded Farmer Keeler in the house that stands on the magnetic hill overlooking the lovely valley and fair village of Moravia. There is something undefinable in the atmosphere of the place. Everybody under the roof seems cheerful, happy, and contented. I think there may have been some 60 arrivals whilst I remained, and each and all, with scarce an exception, seemed to feel at home the moment they entered the door. Nor did I witness more than one unpleasant circumstance whilst under the roof, and that was satisfactorily explained away. During the 11 days I stayed, I never left the house but once, further than the adjoining yard, and then only for an hour or two. Terribly contrary to my disposition and usual wont, I always got up in the morning, in a cold room in January, by candlelight, and lived on the plainest food, and yet can truly say that I never experienced a moment's ennui or depression of spirits at Moravia. With the exception of an occasional private circle, Mary, as Mrs. Andrews is commonly called, generally holds a séance every forenoon and afternoon, including Sundays, at 50 cents for each person. If only 4 or less sit in private, her charge is $2 for the whole. The séance begins with what is called a dark circle, the visitors to the number of 8 or 10, ranging themselves in a semicircle some 8 or 10 feet from the cabinet, which is not used then, on the outside of the partition, of which, directly under the aperture, Mary sits facing the circle. Sometimes the number of visitors requires the making of 2 circles, one within the other. The chairs should be arranged in exact order, the feet of all the sitters kept flat on the floor, and the knees as nearly in a semicircular line as practicable. The hands are then joined, and the light, a very primitive tallow candle, is extinguished. Harmony in the circle is indispensable to secure good manifestations, and this is greatly promoted by singing, in which it is better that all, or a large portion of the circle, should join. It seems to matter but little what the words are, provided the will admit, like old John Brown's body, of being pronounced with a vim. This is probably because they receive closer attention from the members of the circle, and in that way promote harmony by concentrating the thoughts of all present at one point. Old-fashioned witches, probably without knowing why, used to produce a like effect by causing their votaries to look steadily at grounds of tea in a cup. It may be, too, that there is some element that goes forth from the organs of the singers, that is utilized by the spirits and made to contribute to the production of occult voices. In these dark circles the phenomena that occur are quite varied. The floor sometimes assumes a tremulous motion, or the partition of the cabinet is shaken, sometimes violently. Questions are answered by spirit lights, 3 appearing as an affirmative. Keys of the piano are occasionally struck. Water is sprinkled in the faces of the sitters, cold breezes pass around the circle, stars or lights appear in various parts of the room, and sometimes engage in playful exhibitions, as if mingling in a dance. The flapping of something like the wings of a large bird is heard as if close by, and on 2 occasions I and some others were sprinkled with something that felt cold but not moist. Besides these manifestations, spirit voices, sometimes very distinct, generally join in the singing. The hands and persons of sitters are patted by spirit friends, and generally some of these manifest themselves by speaking audibly or in distinct whispers, sometimes at considerable length. Once, while I was present, the tin trumpet was thrown out of the aperture in the cabinet onto the floor, picked up and spoken through by a spirit, then dropped on the floor, and again taken up and thrown back into the cabinet. After some 30 or more minutes have expired, a spirit voice, in a cheerful or jocose tone, and generally with a German or Indian accent, though not always, asks that a light may be struck, and the dark séance closes. Mary now takes her seat in the cabinet opposite the door, which is closed so as to exclude the light. The kerosene lamp is next lighted and set on the piano, turned partly down, the candle extinguished, and the lamp so adjusted by an exceedingly primitive screen as to reflect directly on the aperture in the cabinet. If some visitor would present Mrs. Keeler with a score of wax or spermaceti candles, it might be the means of improving the atmosphere of the room. The members of the circle should sit as before, and again join in singing. Before the faces, arms, or hands appear, the curtain is lifted by the spirits, sometimes in part, or other times in whole. At times the tin trumpet is used by them to speak with through the aperture, their faces not always being visible, though sometimes, on such occasions. More generally, however, they speak audibly without the aid of the trumpet, their faces being visible and even the motion of the lips plainly discernible. After the light séance has continued some 30 minutes or more, a finger generally announces its close by pointing toward the door from the corner of the aperture. At other times, raps or shaking of the cabinet intimate that the medium should be let out. Perhaps this clumsy description may convey to uninitiated readers some idea of the mode that is pursued in obtaining spirit manifestations at Moravia, and of the phenomena that occur more or less at every séance, so that they can better comprehend what follows, as well as much that has before been published on this subject. Upon my arrival on the 27th of December at Mr. Keeler's, I found but 3 or 4 visitors there, including a Mr. Livingstone, who resided not many miles away, and Mrs. Kate Gibbs, of Utica, New York, both of them highly mediumistic and friends of the family, and familiar with the phenomena that usually occur. At the first séance, held on the afternoon of the 27th instant, the manifestations were weak and unsatisfactory both in the dark and light circle. At the latter, 2 male faces appeared at the same time, but were too indistinct to be recognized or described. I was told by those present that for several weeks past the power had been daily decreasing and apparently dying out. Mr. Keeler himself told me that he was not expecting the usual manifestations to continue, as the spirits were about making a change. Mary, the medium, seemed also downhearted and discouraged, and I began to fear that the object of my visit to Moravia would prove a failure. Before leaving New York I had 2 sittings with Mrs. Studd, 53 East 20th Street, at which my wife and 2 daughters came among others, and reiterated their intention, as before conveyed through the mediumship of Mrs. Rockwood, 14 East Springfield Street, Boston, of showing themselves to me at Moravia. My daughter Anna, who passed away in early womanhood, told me that she meant to hand me a lily, her favorite flower when in earth life. The communications made through Mrs. Studd were in writing, which I read and put in my valise, not knowing that I should ever refer to them again. But on learning the state of things at Moravia, I reread them and was surprised to find how nearly some of the statements they contained tallied with what I found existing there, especially 2 communications purporting to emanate from the spirit of Theodore Parker, extracts from which I give below, word for word, exactly as written by the hand of Mrs. Studd, December 14th and 21st, 1871. Quote, "My friend, I promise you, if you will remain to join the circle which will gather, to add another crowning proof to your faith. We know that you have the attracting power, and all we ask is the time. There are so many going there that, as you are well aware, the place requires some change of magnetism and the medium some instruction. Men and women who go entirely out of curiosity are very apt to carry with them an adulterated magnetism, which leaves sometimes an odor and a sphere very disagreeable to a more advanced spirit. The wonder is that it has run so long as it has without an entire break-up. The medium seldom has a person sit down with her who regards her with the slightest degree of humanity. Indeed, they hold her responsible for all disappointments that may arise, and expect from her the greater manifestation from the fact of their unbelief. We desire to have you give her some encouragement, and we ask also that you remain as long as possible, making some suggestions, which we will give you, to improve the condition of affairs there. The fact is, the medium is already in a transition state, and the control are undecided whether to remove or increase the manifestations. I want the cabinet simplified and made more convenient, for as these manifestations increase there, they will spread everywhere, and the result will be spirits talking face to face with man. I see great advancement and earnest investigation everywhere. One thing is certain, nothing else can make man a law to himself and a light to others. And there is but one thing to look for progress in, namely, individual reform, learning to think and act for oneself. I will not interfere with your family circle, but will show myself, if possible, to you. I await any questions you may see fit to ask." End quote. I will here just say that Mr. Keeler assured me before I left Moravia that he would rebuild the cabinet. At a second sitting, December 21st, the same spirit said, quote, I come with you, my friend, to-night, and well pleased to meet you. I come to offer our congratulations and ask you to go forward in the path of progress, being bold in the truth. The time has arrived when all material things point to a verification of what was told you so long ago. The great struggles for truth are still going on, the conflict still being waged, and heaven and earth are acting in concert to produce to man the proper evidences of life immortal. Your articles have made a better basis for mediums and opened the way for us to do our work better. We ask that you go to Moravia. We promise to meet you there, and will talk face to face with you. Do not allow anything to interfere with you. Go alone, and be prepared to wait a few days at least. Do not be hastened away, nor let those come in with you who are in any way disagreeable. We shall advise your going in what we call the holiday week, for the reason that most persons will be at home at that time, and there will be less confusion there. In finishing this, we will give you a list of who will meet you there, and we ask that you throw off all external care and wait patiently until we come. We promise and will perform. Daniel Webster, Theodore Parker, your mother, wife, and 2 daughters, plain." Here the control was suddenly broken by an interruption. Both before going and whilst at Moravia, I frequently stated that I had seen and heard enough to satisfy me beyond doubt of a future state of existence, and that the object of my visit was not so much to obtain any new light for my own satisfaction as for that of others, believing that if I could see a spirit face so clearly as to be willing to affirm to its identity, it might be the means of causing some others to break away from the trammels of early education and habit and investigate the subject for themselves. I was therefore careful to say nothing to compromise my object, and further than the bestowal of a few words of encouragement and sympathy upon the medium, I said nothing until several days after my arrival at Moravia in connection with the foregoing spirit communications. On the next day, the 28th, the manifestations were somewhat better, both in the dark and light circles, than they had been, as was said, for some weeks. A daughter of Mr. Livingstone, who died in very early infancy, came and delivered quite a lengthy and highly instructive discourse. Several hands and arms were plainly exhibited, both outside and immediately within the cabinet, some of which were acknowledged as my wife's and daughter's. What purported to be my own mother showed herself so that I could clearly see her plain Quaker bonnet with cap beneath, but not her face distinctly enough to recognize it. Others present, whose eyesight was stronger than mine, described the features, however, as very much resembling hers. She also spoke for a minute or two very sensibly and characteristically, but not in her natural voice, but like one speaking through a trumpet, which might have been the case, as her face was not visible while speaking. Although I felt no doubt of her identity, and so expressed myself, she seemed disappointed that I could not see her more plainly, and made repeated efforts to bring her face further forward into the light. I regretted that I had not brought an opera glass with me, which might have assisted my vision. On the forenoon of the next day, the 29th, my mother showed herself again in the same bonnet and cap, but I was still unable to distinguish her features so as to recognize them, although I had no doubt, as before, of her identity. Several newcomers had joined this morning circle, and among them G.E. Hoyt of Chicago, who seemed to possess a magnetism wonderfully attractive to spirits. At this séance several of his deceased relatives and friends showed themselves plainly, and conversed intelligently with him. I question whether there were any persons present who doubted their individual identity, though it would require a volume to describe the various shades and characters of phenomena that occur at only one of these sittings, so as to make them intelligible to readers who have never witnessed the manifestations. The following account, given me by a highly intelligent gentleman from Watkins, Schuyler Company, New York, who was present, will convey probably as good an idea of what generally occurs at one séance as can be given in equal space. Moravia, New York, December 30th, 1871. Mr. Thomas R. Hazard. Dear Sir, I considered it a pleasant duty to give my testimony as to what I saw at Mr. Maurice Keeler's Friday morning, December 29th. The first face shown at the aperture was so indistinct I could not decide what it was, but upon the spirit being requested to make an effort to give us something we could recognize, the face was shown several times, each time a little more distinct than at former efforts, until we were convinced that it was a colored woman's face. The next face was rather indistinct, but I think someone recognized it. The third face was so plain that the gentleman at once, without any hesitation or equivocation, positively asserted it to be his mother, to which the old lady bowed assent, and seemed rejoiced that her son so promptly recognized her. The fourth face was that of my own dear sister Emily, every lineament of which was shown with the utmost and unmistakable distinctness. When young, she fell against the stove and cut quite a gash in her cheek, and always carried the scar. The scar was now shown as plain as in the earth life. I asked several questions, and in every instance got perfectly satisfactory and truthful answers, either by the nod of her head or by the motion of the hands that were shown through the aperture in the partition. In spite of my best efforts to control my emotions, tears of joy and gratitude flowed, as I knew it was a reality. I felt as though heaven was very near earth. If all could see their friends as distinctly as I saw my sister, there would be no doubt of immortality. The fifth face was very distinct, and I should think thoroughly materialized. It was projected through the aperture far enough so all could see the motions of the lips as he spoke, in an audible voice, in answer to questions propounded to him by a lady from Utica. There was a mutual recognition between the lady and the spirit. In answer to one question, he said, "Thank God, it will be all right yet." The lady seemed pleased, and in fact quite overcome with joy. Audible voices were frequently heard during the séance. Arms and hands were shown plainly, distinctly too, exhibiting arms above the elbow. 4 hands were shown at one time. I have given a truthful statement of a portion of the wonders shown to myself and 10 others. I presume the others present saw as plainly as I did. If any portion of the above hastily drawn description is of any use to you, you are welcome to it. Yours respectfully, W.I. Vesilius, M.D. At the afternoon séance no faces or hands were exhibited, one of the controlling spirits assigning as a reason that they were endeavoring to arrange to make the faces more distinct, so that those whose eyesight was not strong might see them plainer. This the spirit succeeded in doing, and for the remainder of the time that I attended the circles I could see the features of many of the faces that were exhibited as clearly as if I had met them on the street at noonday. Still, greatly to my annoyance, my own mother never sufficiently succeeded in materializing her features so as to make them plain and absolutely recognizable to me, although, at my request, she would move her face from one side of the aperture to the other and place it in other different points of view. On one occasion I remarked that although I could not distinctly see her features, I felt entirely sure it was my own mother, to which she rejoined in a distinct whisper, "Yes, Thomas, it is as true as that the sun rises." I think this manifestation occurred at a private séance on January the 4th. Besides showing her face in the light, my mother came several times in the dark circles and manifested her presence by patting my head or hand with hers, or by speaking sometimes at considerable length in an audible, though not her natural earth voice. At one time she seemed to stand close by, in front of where I was sitting, and with a mother's affectionate partiality said in a distinct whisper, "Thomas, my son, I am with you in all your good works." It would take too much space to describe even a moiety of the manifestations I witnessed at the score and more séances I attended at Moravia. I will therefore just refer to a few of the incidents that occurred, and hasten to conclude with a narrative of some that more particularly related to my own spirit family. As before remarked, Mr. Hoyt, who was a most earnest and outspoken spiritualist, and I should think, in every sense of the word, a live man, seemed endued with an organism or magnetism singularly adapted to intercourse with the denizens of the spirit world. He passed through New York on his way to Moravia, where he had sittings with Charles H. Foster and Dr. Slade, before one or the other, or both of which mediums, I understood him to say. Every individual friend who subsequently appeared at Moravia had announced their intention of so doing, and among these, Owasso, an attendant Indian guide of Dr. Slade's. It seems that Mr. Hoyt has 3 wives in the spirit world, each and all of whom showed themselves to him unmistakably at Moravia. One of these, who had died of consumption, appeared in her night clothes, holding a handkerchief close to her chin. She anticipated Mr. Hoyt in giving an explanation by putting it to her mouth, as with a feeble cough she expectorated upon it, and folded it up in her hand precisely as Mr. Hoyt said she had been accustomed to do for some weeks or months before her death. After this, another of Mr. Hoyt's wives, with 2 of her children, were successively passed by the inside of the aperture in the cabinet in reclining attitudes, bundled up in what looked like bedclothes, including, in the instance of one of the children, a red blanket. These manifestations seemed rather mysterious until Mr. Hoyt stated that his wife and 2 children died of the smallpox, and to avoid spreading the infection were wrapped up in their beds and so buried. Several others of Mr. Hoyt's friends showed themselves distinctly and conversed with him, and among these was the Indian Owasso, who said he came to fulfill his promise made to Mr. Hoyt at the man Slade's. In answer to queries, Owasso said he came through the power of magnetism he brought from Dr. Slade's, and should return to Dr. S. on the strength of what he could obtain from the circle at which he was then present. One of the most active and efficient controlling spirits of both the dark and light circle at Moravia is an Indian squaw called Honto. She frequently spoke very sensibly, though characteristically of her Indian origin. On one occasion, while delivering quite a lengthy discourse in clear and forcible language, she took pride in exhibiting a beautiful scarlet blanket that was richly trimmed and ornamented with beads more brilliant than glass or even diamonds. Parts of the blanket were occasionally pushed some inches outside of the aperture, where they would remain for a minute or more, and then be drawn in, probably to rematerialize, and again put forth. In depth and richness of color, I think the scarlet equaled anything I have ever seen, and, with the addition of the dazzling beads, produced the most pleasing and striking effect. Mrs. Kate Gibbs, before alluded to, has a very intelligent and interesting angel guide, whose spirit name is Rosa. She has been thoroughly identified as the spirit of a young Indian girl named Suki, who passed from earth life some years ago in the neighborhood of Utica. It is customary to hold circles on almost every evening in the spirit room at Moravia, apart from those for the usual manifestations, there generally being more or less mediums from a distance present. On these occasions the bright and ever cheerful little Rosa occupied a prominent position. Mr. Keeler seemed mischievously fond of teasing her, and on one occasion twitted her with not having so pretty a blanket as Honto. This brought out the childlike earth feelings of Rosa, who pettishly replied, "Yes, Honto, Honto. Nobody is anything but Honto. Me got blanket as pretty as Honto." At a subsequent cabinet séance, Rosa came and talked for some minutes mostly with her Meddy, as she called Mrs. Gibbs, during which time she pushed her red blanket, as Honto had done, out of the aperture for us to admire. It was very pretty, but not as deep a scarlet color as Honto's, nor was it ornamented with beads. In answer to a query trenching on theology, Rosa gave us to understand that all that related to such matters might be summed up in 6 words, viz., goodness is godliness and happiness is heaven. After the close of the cabinet séance, Rosa was too impatient to wait for the customary evening circle, but entranced Mrs. Gibbs in the common sitting-room and asked how we liked her blanket. I replied that I thought it very pretty, but Mr. Keeler rather cruelly reminded her that it had no beads like Honto's. At this Rosa showed a good deal of feeling, and said she was going to have some beads. When asked how she would string and fix them without anything to do it with, she replied that they did not need needle and thread to make such things where she was. One of the most striking and vivid faces I saw at the aperture was that of a man who called his name George Butler. Nearly all the faces that are exhibited at Moravia have their eyes protected from the effects of the light by spectacles. Butler, who I learned had manifested several times before, showed himself without them, and his eyes had a peculiar ghastly appearance, like one under the influence of extreme bodily pain or terror. He said that he was murdered by one W. in drunken brawl that recently occurred in a saloon at Syracuse, that he had no friends present, and well knew that all he said could have no legal effect, but that he was killed by a blow on the temple inflicted by a billet of wood, and that his murderer would soon confess the crime. The whole scene was very graphic, and indicative that the time might come when the adage that dead men tell no tales may have to be modified to make it conform to the truth, and the saying that murder will out will be no longer a myth. Some of the spirits who spoke had passed from earth under the belief that there was no future state of existence, while others were imbued with the theological idea of a fiery hell. All such gratefully acknowledged their mistake, and joined with others in bearing testimony to the fact substantially that no mere form of worship or belief can help to prepare any human being for a happy entrance into the spirit world, and that the status mortals attain to on passing to the higher life is in conformity with the freedom and expansion of their minds, the good works they have done from unselfish motives, and the degrees of charity, sympathy, and love they have manifested and exercised in their intercourse with their fellow creatures on earth. A few days before I left, there came to Moravia a trance medium from Rochester by the name of Gilbert G. Eaton, one of whose controlling spirits professed to be the notorious Captain Kidd, who did not seem inclined to say much about his earth career, but admitted that he had, when in earth life, a hard, determined will. He further stated that he always thought he was condemned to death on insufficient testimony, and that the piracies for which he suffered were committed on Spanish vessels with the approval or connivance of the British government, until complications became so serious that it was deemed expedient to sacrifice his life to appease the Spaniards. In reply to a query concerning his entrance into spirit life, he stated that when he came to consciousness he found himself wandering in a darksome, dreary desert, where no vegetation other than stinted, unsightly shrubs was to be found, and where the spirits he encountered were each and all so repulsive and loathsome to each other that no two or more ever cared to meet or associate. In this forlorn condition he passed what to him seemed centuries of earth life, when his spirit became so broken and overpowered with suffering that in an agony of despair he threw himself upon the ground and cried earnestly on God for deliverance. Then for the first time he saw in the far-off distance a bright spot in the shape of a small anchor, from which trailed within his reach a thread of light. Guided by this, he succeeded in reaching the anchor, and from that point was enabled to see and communicate with his mother, through whose loving counsel and assistance he was started on the road of progress, and through the strength of the same strong will-power that had, when misdirected, sunk him so low in hell, he was enabled, when this was rightly directed, the sooner to reach the place he now occupied in heaven. This was the substance of what Kyd stated, but whether true or false, or whether it may have been some other spirit personating Kyd or not, he certainly did subsequently give us a most graphic relation of the mode pursued by spirits in showing themselves at Moravia. He told us in terse and definite language, remarkably free from the redundancy that frequently characterizes mediumistic communications, that the spirits who show their limbs and faces at the aperture are actually within the cabinet, though invisible to material eyes, in their own proper persons, and that the limbs and faces that are shown undergo a chemical process analogous to that adopted by mortals in coating or galvanizing specimens of wood or other substances and metals with a wash of another kind of metal. He stated that this material coating for the spirit form is collected by the spirits and partially prepared during the dark circle from the aura or effete particles that are constantly passing from the human body, the cold breeze that is so often felt by the persons present being a part of this aura, and that the consistency or efficiency of the material depends upon the degree of harmony that prevails in the circle. He further stated that these effete particles cannot be used by the spirit chemists until they are vitalized so as to make them partake of the quality of living flesh, and to do this it is necessary to pass them through or bring them in contact with a human organism possessing certain qualities or properties such as appertain to Mrs. Andrews, who always sits opposite the aperture during the process of collecting, preparing, and passing the material into the cabinet. Mr. Eaton's controlling spirit also asserted that the manufacturing of this occult material requires that certain elements should be abstracted from every organ of the medium, and that on some occasions where the manifestations required high coloring, the spirit artists had drawn as many as 4 ounces of actual blood from her veins. It was said further that should any material substance, especially if in a fluid or semi-fluid state, be brought in contact with the spirit faces or limbs that are exhibited, the coarser particles of such substance will necessarily appear on the person of the medium, the pores of whose skin operate similarly to a fine sieve or strainer, and on the return of the elements that had been subtracted from her system exclude the coarser particles of the foreign substance. This coating of the spirit, Eaton's controlling guardian stated, was of too delicate a quality to resist for any great length of time the chemical effects of light. Though the spirits seemed confident that they should soon perfect and improve the processes so as to enable them to walk out of the doors of cabinets and greet their earth friends as naturally as when they were clothed with mortal flesh. The theory here put forth, if not substantially true, seems at least plausible, and to my mind is greatly strengthened by what follows. On my return from Moravia, I passed through Boston, where I learned from Mr. Luther Colby that at a recent private séance given by Mrs. Annie Lord Chamberlain at the rooms of Mrs. J. H. Conant, 76 Waltham Street, Boston, the following answer was received from a spirit guide of the medium to the question by what process do the invisibles materialize the hands, faces, and other forms that from time to time are shown at circles held for physical demonstration of spirit power. The influence controlling at the time replied, quote, that the refined matter out of which these apparitions were formed, or at least rendered cognizable by mortal senses, was gathered from the individuals composing the circle, each contributing to the supply. The raw material was then collected together in a mass, as the housewife, having kneaded the dough for bread, prepares it to be rolled out into any form desired, and a certain portion, sufficient for the manifestations about to be made, divided from it. This portion, by the subtle force of spirit chemistry, was deposited in solution in a vapor or atmospheric bath over the heads of the circle, just as the copper is held in solution in the bath of the battery for electrotyping. Immediately the spirit's hand or other object is plunged in the bath, and as is the case with the copper upon the plate, in the process above referred to, the earthly matter in solution becomes precipitated upon the surface of the spirit object to be shown, and the form thus coated with said earthly material becomes tangible and visible to physical senses." Singularly enough, this explanation, as given, was sustained in part by Mrs. Catherine Morrison, the well-known blind trance and clairvoyant medium of Oswego, who happened to come to Moravia whilst I was there. On 2 occasions Mrs. M. said to me naively, when sitting beside her in 2 different light seances, that she saw spirits in the cabinet mixing something that looked like dough, she using the same unique term to express the same idea that Mrs. Chamberlain did. Besides a wife, I have of my own immediate family in the spirit world a daughter named Mary, who died in 1842, aged 2 1/4 years, a grown-up daughter named Anna, who died young, in 1868, and 3 premature infants who never saw the light of earth days. I have abundant evidence, however, that these last have progressed toward maturity in a corresponding degree to what they would have done had they been naturally born and continued in earth life, and though they have not the fullness of development and being they might, through the experience of a material existence, have acquired in the rudimental sphere, still they are a happy, joyous little group. This, with millions of the same class, are those that are known and designated as angels by many spirits in the other world, for the reason that they have never been subjected to the trials and temptations incident to mortal existence, and are consequently free from its stains. My daughter Mary seems to have learned a great deal concerning earth life by communicating with me, the germ necessary to its acquirement having been partially developed while here. But still her spirit seems more closely allied with heaven than earth. In her frequent visits through different media, she almost always comes with her hands full of flowers, gathered, as she says, from her own garden, purposely for her father, nor as she affectionately places them in my bosom, or entwines them about my head, can I readily convince her that my earth senses are totally unconscious of the beautiful decoration. I have before stated that at a séance held with Mrs. Stad in New York, a few days before I went to Moravia, my daughter Anna said she would hand me a lily whilst I was there. I also find my reference to a memorandum that my wife assured me whilst at Mrs. Rockwood's in Boston on the 9th of last November, that she felt confident she and our 2 daughters Anna and Mary would be able to show themselves to me at Moravia, entwined in each other's arms, the last named characteristically wreathed or garlanded with flowers. On inspecting the cabinet at Moravia, I saw at the first glance that the aperture would not admit of such a manifestation as this, but the circumstance did not disconcert me in the least, having learned through experience that the spirits of mortals are, except in degree, no more infallible or omniscient in one sphere of existence than in another. The hands and arms that were shown at the aperture, unlike the faces, were always plain and distinct. On an occasion early after my arrival, wherein several hands of different sizes were passed by in the inside of the cabinet, one of them held a flower which I thought I recognized, but, to be sure, I asked a lady who sat beside me what it was. She promptly replied, a lily. I then asked if the hand holding it was meant for me, and it was shown again in token of assent. During my stay this manifestation was repeated several times, and I have no doubt that the hand with the lily in it was, as it purported to be, my daughter Anna's, and one or more of the smaller hands her sister Mary's. My wife also threw her arms full length, with hands clasped out of the aperture on several occasions, always in a night dress, which I suppose was meant to represent what she wore in her last sickness. The sleeves were uniformly buttoned close to the hand, and I am sure that the exhibition could not have been more natural, including the folds and drapery of the garment, had she made a like manifestation before her departure from earth life. From the first I had been careful, for obvious reasons, not to mention my wife's or daughter's name. At a séance where there was an attempted demonstration at the aperture, so indistinct and feeble that I could neither see nor hear anything that transpired in that direction, I was rather startled upon hearing a lady, who had but recently arrived, observe, "She says Fanny Haggard." On asking the lady to repeat the name, she did the first, and observed that the last sounded something like Haggard. On another occasion a small star, enveloped in a mist-like halo, passed slowly upward from the bottom of the aperture and disappeared at the top. This was twice repeated, and upon my asking that it might show itself again if it was meant to represent my wife, it did so instantly and remained stationary for a short time before its final disappearance. This was a beautiful manifestation of which none present could know the full significance but myself. For the last 15 years my wife has been accustomed to draw a star through some automatic and writing mediums I sit with to announce her presence. It appears to be the name she is called by in her spirit home. Often, too, when I sit with trance or clairvoyant mediums, they will say, "Your star is here." The Sunday before I left Boston, on my way to Moravia, via New York, I attended one of Mrs. Hardy's, now 4 Concord Square, large evening circles. I had never sat with her at a private séance, and she could have known but little about me. But the little child that controls her called me out of the crowd from quite a distance to the medium's side and said, "Your star is here," and that it was so bright it would shine in sunlight. Though it may not have shone in sunlight at Moravia, it certainly did very plainly in lamplight. Mrs. Gibbs' Indian guide, the bright, sprightly little Rosa, used to keep me well posted up in what was transpiring behind the scenes in the cabinet with regard to my own family and spirit friends. She described my wife as always present, but generally standing back, partly because she could not attain the proper conditions to show herself distinctly, and partly to give place to other spirits who were anxious to manifest themselves to their friends, a self-sacrificing feature that was strikingly characteristic of her in earth life. At one time Rosa said she saw her doing, because she could not show herself to me, what they call weeping. Finally her repeated arduous but unavailing efforts became oppressive to me, and I told my wife repeatedly, sometimes directly, as she attempted to show herself, and at other times through Rosa or the controlling spirit of some other medium present, that I was fully satisfied of her presence and hoped she would not distress herself further on my account. Hitherto I had sat altogether at the regular séances, the conditions of which were constantly being changed by the daily introduction of new and not always perfectly harmonious visitors. I had come to the conclusion that my staying longer would be of no avail, and proposed leaving Moravia. Previous to doing so, Mr. Hoyt and myself had arranged to hold a private séance on the 4th of January, he intending to leave on the 5th. On the 3rd instant, Mrs. Catherine Morrison, the interesting blind medium before mentioned, arrived from Oswego. On the same evening a circle for ordinary manifestations was held in the spirit room. Mrs. Morrison was beautifully controlled by a little girl who, at 5 years of age, perished, as she said, in the fire at Chicago. In answer to queries, she told us that she never had any father, but was promised one in the spirit world. We learned that her mother had been killed by her father. She said her name was Lily Warner, and she also named the street in which she lived in Chicago, and an apothecary's shop on the corner where she used to look through the window at some objects that interested her childish fancy. I think Mr. Hoyt, to whom the child seemed strongly attracted, recognized the locality. On Lily's intimating that she had learned to sing a little, we begged her to sing for us. She seemed to doubt our sincerity in making the request, and asked us coyly whether we really wanted to hear her. Upon our reassurance, she said she never learned but 2 pieces, and would sing one of them, Autumn Up an Apple Tree, which she did in a sweet infantile voice that sensibly moved the feelings of those present, and carried handkerchiefs to some eyes. On being praised for what she had accomplished, Lily volunteered to sing her other song, Ma, May I Go Out to Swim, which she did in the same sweet plaintive strain as the other, though the words and measure were not quite so pretty. After she came out of trance, Mrs. Morrison, who was clairvoyant when in her normal condition, turned to me and described a lady, answering to my wife, who she said was writing something for me against the projection in the wall of the room very near where I sat. On my asking her to tell me what its purport was, Mrs. M. read it off as follows: Thomas, stay 2 days longer, and I think I can show myself to you. I asked her to intimate to my wife that I would cheerfully comply with her request, which she did. On the next day, after the 2 usual séances were closed, Mr. Keeler, Mrs. Gibbs, Mr. Hoyt, and myself held our private séance. The light was no sooner extinguished than we perceived a marked and favourable change in the manifestations. The little stars that were wont to appear in the preliminary dark circle at most of the séances were much brighter and more numerous than usual, and played about us with uncommon vivacity. Mr. Keeler subsequently told me that he had seen such little stars gradually expand and assume the appearance of human faces. The accompanying spirit voices were also remarkably strong and distinct. We were assured by a guardian spirit of the medium that if a harmonious company, such as the one then present, could be convened for a few consecutive days, the manifestations would become far more powerful and vivid than any we had witnessed. In the light séances that followed, Mrs. Gibbs received many affectionate words of encouragement and counsel from her spirit guardians. My own mother came, and as usual identified herself to my entire satisfaction in both the dark and light circles. My wife also exhibited her arms, full length, clothed in her usual drapery, but in a more desponding attitude than heretofore, they being bent and thrown upward, with the pale attenuated hands tightly clasped, as if in earnest supplication or prayer. I thought I discerned the meaning she intended to convey, and what little renewed hopes I had entertained of her being able to show her features to me distinctly almost entirely faded from my mind. Several delicately formed hands of different sizes, that looked as plain and real as if in earth life, were passed by the aperture just within the cabinet, one of them holding the customary lily. On this occasion its petals exactly resembled those of the water lily, and were of the most glistening white. These were for a considerable time turned in a full-blown point of view directly toward us, but with some of the petals so arranged as to hide the axil or seed bud. It looked so real and tangible that it seemed as if I might reach forth my hand and grasp it, and I asked my daughter, whose materialized spirit form was of course invisible, to throw the lily out of the cabinet, if she could not hand it to me. On this it was passed slowly along, and several efforts evidently made to do as I requested, as those present remarked at the time, but without success. A few days after this, while sitting with Mrs. Bell Bowditch, 798 Washington Street, Boston, who could not have known anything connected with my visit to Moravia, I asked my daughter Anna if she could tell me, through the memory of the medium, what she brought me at Moravia. She promptly replied, "A lily, Pa." A day or two after this I propounded the same question at Mrs. Mary Carlyle's, 94 Campden Street, Boston, to my daughter, and she replied, "2 lilies, Pa." It is highly probable that both answers were correct, as there was certainly a difference in the appearance of the flowers that were exhibited at the aperture in the cabinet. With the close of this day the time would expire that was allotted by the friend of Mrs. Morrison for his stay at Moravia. She had attended several séances, but had received but little, if anything, satisfactory, and intimated that she would be pleased if Mr. Hoyt and herself would permit her to join us in our contemplated private séance. As we were both going away very soon, and wished to give our spirit friends at least one favourable opportunity to manifest their presence, we were reluctantly declined acceding to Mrs. Morrison's request. On passing downstairs, I found her in the sitting-room a good deal distressed, in consequence of being obliged to leave her home in the morning without having obtained what she desired from her spirit friends. The amiability with which she bore her disappointment caused me to feel additional interest on her behalf, and I interceded with her to stay another day, promising that Mr. Benjamin Fish, an elderly friendly gentleman from Rochester, and myself would ask her to join us in a private séance we had already arranged for with Mrs. Andrews, to be held on the next day. The friend who accompanied Mrs. M. was largely engaged in business, and declined remaining longer, until finally spirit friends interfered and advised them to stay another day. On the morrow, Friday the 5th instant, the manifestations at the public circles passed off as usual. One of the clairvoyant mediums that had recently arrived, whose name I do not this moment recall, told me, while we were sitting in the light circle, that she saw a lady friend of mine in the cabinet, with a girdle made of green leaves about her waist. I asked if she could learn her name, whereupon she looked that way a moment, and said she saw the name Fanny on the girdle. She then said she saw a younger lady there with a like girdle inscribed with the name of Anna, and that they wished her to convey to me from them the words, "Our love is ever fresh and green for you." In the afternoon, Mrs. Keeler, Mrs. Morrison and her friend, Mr. Fish, and myself composed our private circle. The lights that appeared and the spirit voices were quite equal to what they had previously been, whilst the keys of the piano were more frequently struck than at any time when I had been present. The spirit wife of Benjamin Fish came and laid her hand on his head, and said, "I thank God that I can add to thy happiness." As far as my own experience enabled me to determine, the spirit hands at Moravia have none of the cold and velvet-like feeling usual in such phenomena, but were so natural that their touch could not be distinguished from that of the hands of persons in earth life. A deceased wife and brother of the friend of Mrs. Morrison also came and conversed with him, but far the largest portion of the time was occupied by the spirit friends of Mrs. Morrison, the guardian of Mrs. Andrews, announcing that the light circle would be dispensed with for the especial benefit of the blind medium. Quite a number of Mrs. M.'s personal friends and guardians announced their presence and conversed freely with her. It seems that Mrs. Morrison's husband was then constructing for her a cabinet at Oswego, where they have been promised that spirits will take on the form and manifest their presence as they do at Moravia. She received special instructions in regard to the finishing and furnishing of this cabinet, accompanied with many words of counsel, encouragement, and good cheer. This was the last day of the 2, on one of which my wife had notified me she hoped to be able to show her face to me. Of course, in the absence of the light circle, this could not be, but the disappointment was almost gratifying to me in view of the perfect delight that was evinced by the little blind medium. I remarked to her that she seemed in a very different mood from what she was the previous day. She said in reply, "I could sit here forever." Her joyousness remained when, with the good wishes of all, she left the house next morning, her sweet though sightless face beaming with happiness and radiant with spirit light. I have dwelt longer on these incidents than I might have done were it not that it has been borne on my mind that the full fruition that finally attended upon my stay at Moravia was in some occult way connected with the self-sacrificing kindliness and sympathy that I had extended to the blind medium of Oswego. Before the séance just spoken of was held, I had concluded to remain another day, in consequence of disappointment in receiving expected letters, and Mr. Fish and myself arranged with Mrs. Andrews to have one more private séance after the 2 public ones were over, on the afternoon of the next day, Saturday the 6th instant, to which we invited Mrs. S.A. Wortman, a highly mediumistic lady who had, with several friends, recently arrived from Buffalo. Both the morning and afternoon public circles on that day, though unusually large, were quite good. Several faces were shown very distinctly, and other manifestations occurred, highly interesting. In the afternoon my wife threw her arms out of the aperture as usual, so far as concerns drapery and general appearance, but with a quick, lively motion that encouraged me to ask if she still meant to make another effort to show her face. In reply, an arm was instantly thrown upward, some 12 or 15 inches above the top of the aperture, in the full light, while she rapped animatingly on the partition with her fingers, as if trying the keys of a piano preparatory to executing some joyous piece of music. I could see the natural and most minute movement, not only of the fingers, but of the knuckles and sinews on the back of the thin, pale hand as plainly as it is possible to discern like movements of the hand of any mortal in earth life. It was at this séance the unpleasant circumstance occurred I have before alluded to, wherein a stranger present made a rude and wholly uncalled for remark, which was, however, afterwards satisfactorily explained away, to which I hastily replied, perhaps too much in the same spirit. All that was said was in whispers, but still it may be seen, by what will follow, that the circumstance did not pass unobserved by the spirits. For several days the weather had been lowering and unpleasant, but early in the afternoon the clouds began to disappear, and when our private circle was convened, consisting of Mrs. Keeler, Mrs. Wortman, Mr. Fish, and myself, the atmosphere was bright, clear, and electric. Mrs. W. is a very sensitive medium, and we had hardly composed ourselves in our seats, some 5 or 6 feet from the aperture, and joined hands, when she remarked how harmonious the atmosphere was, and unlike anything she had experienced in the previous promiscuous circles. With her many other accomplishments, Mrs. W. has a clear, soft, melodious voice, and she and Mrs. Keeler had scarcely begun to sing, the light being extinguished, before the space in front of us was unusually alive with bright little stars. These would congregate in groups, and then swiftly bound apart in couples, and again approach and retire, in the same order as if performing in a dance. Then again commence circling around each other in single pairs, until the whole galaxy would mingle and form one group, and all engage in the angel sport, playfully winding and intertwining rapidly around and between each other in an inextricable, bewildering maze, alike beautiful and indescribable. On several stanzas of Home, Sweet Home, being sung with animation, a masculine spirit voice exceeding in power and pathos any, either human or spiritual, I had ever before heard, joined in the singing, and continued to the end. Upon the same stanzas being repeated, the spirit's vocalist, as if to afford us an opportunity to contrast its power with the voices present, or perhaps that it might gather up its own full strength, forbore joining in the concert until the second stanza, when, through all that followed, it poured forth its loud, soul-thrilling strains in a cataract of melody that overpowered and absorbed the human voices present as completely as the hoarse roar of Niagara the gentle murmurs of the little brook that loses itself in the bosom of its mighty waters. This is no fancy or imaginative sketch, as I know all present at the time, if appealed to, will admit. It seemed as if the spirit vocalist, conscious of his unfaltering powers, was absolutely glorying in the greatness of his strength, and I have no question, although I confess to an almost total ignorance of the rules of artistic music, that if Mr. Gilmore could receive his assistance, together with the necessary harmonious conditions, in the mammoth concert that is to be enacted at his contemplated heaven-inspired international or world's musical peace jubilee, the performance will attract more attention and excite greater interest and admiration in the public mind than all exhibitions of mere human musical talent have ever yet called forth. After Home, Sweet Home had been twice repeated, I asked that, Oft in the Stilly Night, a favorite melody of my wife's when in earth life, might be sung. Several stanzas were sung by the ladies present, in which a sweet feminine spirit voice joined in concert, though I failed to recognize it as that of my wife. Among many other exhibitions that occurred after this in the dark circle, several friends of Mrs. Wortman manifested themselves to her. Benjamin Fish's wife came again, patted him on the knee, and said in a low voice, "God be praised that we can come." My own daughter Anna announced her presence by placing her hand, as soft and natural as if in earth life, on mine, and said in a low but distinct voice, "Forgive those, Pa, who hurt your feelings." As I did not respond immediately, the request was coaxingly repeated, "When anything is said that agitates you, Pa, think of my Lily and forgive." I regarded the manifestation of the lily as a remarkably pleasant incident, and had so spoken of it more than once. I answered that I would do so, which seemed to satisfy her. My spirit daughter seemed near enough for me to have felt her warm breath had she been mortal, and I said, "Kiss me, Anna, if not my lips, my forehead." Immediately I felt a gentle and distinct presence on my forehead, but whether made by her fingers or lips I could not determine. In the light circle that followed, Albert and Thomas, two sons of Benjamin Fish, showed their faces and talked with their father. They were fully recognized. Albert, in referring to the doubts he had of a future state of existence when in earth life, said, "We still live." One of the sons said to the father, "We are happy that thee has a dear companion to cheer thee in thy old age." Mr. Fish had been in the house but a few days, and I doubt whether the medium, or any one present except myself, knew that he had been recently married to a second wife. Mr. Fish's deceased wife came and showed herself as she looked in early womanhood. It was asked if she meant to show her features as they appear in spirit life. To this she nodded assent and disappeared, but immediately returned, looking as she did when she passed from earth at the age of 70. Mrs. D., a lady from Buffalo, told me subsequently that a friend once showed herself to her in rapid succession at the aperture of the cabinet in Moravia, as she looked at 6 different periods of her life, ranging from youth to old age. Although I was conscious that my wife, aided by her spirit friends, was exerting herself to the utmost to perfect the necessary conditions to show herself plainly to me, I had but little hope that she would succeed, when suddenly, toward the last of the séance, I saw a face gradually developing or approaching the aperture that I soon unmistakably recognized as hers. She seemed highly gratified at the recognition, and so expressed herself. As is usual with most of the spirits who show themselves, her eyes were protected from the light by spectacles. Mrs. W., who was not fully aware of the circumstances, asked if my wife wore spectacles. I said no, she did not, upon which the face instantly disappeared, but as quickly returned again without the spectacles, looking as natural as in earth life. I said, "It is enough, Fanny, I want no more. I am now fully satisfied." Upon this, she thrust her face partly out of the aperture, and said in a clear, loud whisper, "We have tried hard, Thomas, to make myself plain to you, and I thank God that we have succeeded." My wife was within 6 feet of where I sat, and I saw her lips move as distinctly and naturally while she was speaking as I ever saw them in earth life. Overcome with joyful emotion, I said, "Kiss me, darling," whereupon her hand was twice raised to her lips as she threw me 2 kisses. A remarkable feature of this last pleasing manifestation was that, although the hand was thrown toward me in the most natural manner, still I saw no arm. This, to my mind, goes to prove the correctness of the explanation that was given of the phenomena of spirit galvanizing or electrotyping by the controlling guides of both Mr. Eaton and Mrs. Chamberlain, as previously related. Probably the hand only was dipped into the prepared material and became visible, whilst the spirit arm, though possessing all the power necessary to control and direct the hand, not being materialized on its surface as the hand was, remained invisible. The whole manifestation, as it occurred, was as unexpected as it was full, complete, and entirely satisfactory. Some 8 to 10 years ago my wife told me, through Mrs. George E. Wilcox, now at 450 High Street, Providence, Rhode Island, that if I would go to the spirit photographer in Boston, Mr. Mumler, whom I had never seen, she thought she could present herself plain enough to be photographed. I went and procured a good likeness of her, but in a night-dress, and looking as she did about the time she passed from earth life. Subsequently, on my asking her why she came in such a questionable shape, my wife told me that her spirit friends could not carry her further back on the occasion than to the point where her earth life terminated. This satisfied me, for I already knew that when spirits first control mediums to personate, they generally bring with them the conditions that attended their latest moments, and as photographing was a new phase of the phenomena, I thought it very probable that similar spirit law might apply in that direction that I already knew prevailed in others. Besides this, my wife has on some occasions shown herself very distinctly to me whilst in sleep, but always in a shadowy form, something analogous to the photograph. Again, for a year or more before my daughter Anna passed away, her mother repeatedly assured both her and myself that she would show herself to her before she passed from earth life. This occurred with wonderful distinctness some few days before Anna died. I was present at the time. My daughter was lying on a lounge and suffering intensely from spasmodic pain that periodically assailed her. I held one of her hands in mine, and her little brother and one or more of her sisters stood near by. Suddenly her countenance changed. The pain had entirely left her, and with a radiant face she looked beyond the side of the sofa and said, "Why, Pa, there is Mother. There is Aunt Gertrude, too." She described them as standing in a beautiful forest, amidst flowers and shrubbery that hid their persons below the waist. I put several questions to my wife, which she answered satisfactorily by signs. The vision was perfectly enchanting to my sick daughter, who had no fear of death afterwards, but looked cheerfully forward to it as a welcome messenger to waft her to her spirit home and friends. But still this manifestation, like the others mentioned, was shadowy. Footnote: since this article has appeared in the Banner of Light, I have read an obituary notice of my daughter in that paper, wherein the following sentences occur that had escaped from my memory until they were recalled by its perusal. They are, as the reader will see, highly suggestive in connection with the lily. Some time before her sickness she saw in a dream a remarkably beautiful lily, unlike any she had ever seen before, which disappeared upon her reaching out her hand to pluck it, whilst a grave opened in the ground beneath where it had stood. This same lily, for the first time since, was now again presented to her interior vision, and upon her asking her spirit mother if she was to join her soon, she smiled and bowed her head in token of assent. End of footnote. Again, for several years past, my wife has occasionally told me, through several different mediums, that, before I joined her in spirit life, she would be able not only to show herself, but converse with me as plainly as she ever did whilst in earth life. It is true, I hope that in this she would succeed. But when I learned, on coming to Moravia, that a large proportion of the spirit faces that were exhibited bore the latest impress of mortal life, I could not flatter myself that my own wife would constitute one of the exceptions to the rule, and show herself to me under more favourable circumstances than most others, especially when I reflected that every manifestation she had made up to almost the last hour of the last day I stayed at Moravia was of the same character that pervaded her spirit photograph. If, therefore, she showed herself at all, I was only prepared to see her appear with the suffering, emaciated face that attended her last moments, corresponding with the attenuated arms and pale hands that had so often been thrust out of the cabinet. It may be imagined, then, what my emotions were, just as the last moment of my last séance was about to expire, to see my wife's face suddenly presented before me, as plain and distinct as I ever saw it in our own house, not as it looked in the last weary hours of her life, nor even yet as it was in less mature years, when the colour had partially faded from her cheeks, but in the full bloom of health, and all the glorious beauty that so preeminently distinguished her early womanhood. Then it was, indeed, that I could comprehend the full significance of the tender emotions I had so often witnessed at Moravia, on the meeting of the living with loved friends, that were dead but alive again, and as my heart swelled with inexpressible gratitude toward the great loving parent of humanity, my tongue involuntarily exclaimed, "Surely, if there is a heaven on earth, it is here." Before this crowning proof, my experiences had banished all doubt from my mind as regards a future state of existence, but now even belief that had passed into knowledge was doubly confirmed. The keystone was placed in the arch from whence I know it never will or can be wrenched away. I had at last obtained all I sought for. I had looked upon the resurrected spirit face of a loved one, the identity of whose features I am not only willing to affirm to, under the pains and penalties of perjury, before any assemblage of mortals or tribunal on earth, but, if need be, swear to it on peril of my salvation before the assembled hosts of heaven and the judgment seat of God. End of 11 Days at Moravia by Thomas Hazard.